Gavin Rourke had been mocking me for years, in the quiet, comfortable way that powerful people mock those they've already dismissed. Tonight, he did it openly at a table full of executives in front of my wife, and Corinne laughed along like the joke had been hers to keep all along. What Gavin didn't know, what almost no one in that room knew, was that the man he'd just humiliated held something over that company that could change everything. The only question was whether he'd realize his mistake before I decided to let him find out. If you want to hear how this ends, consider subscribing. Stories like this one come out every week, and I think you'll want to be around for them. The morning of the dinner, I sat at my desk with a cup of coffee and read an email I had been half expecting for weeks. It came from an address made up of random characters, no name, no signature. But the writing inside was careful and exact. Whoever had sent it knew Langston Freight Systems. From the inside, they flagged specific contract numbers, named specific vendors, pointed to specific approval dates that didn't line up. It was the 6th email like this in 5 years. Every single one had been accurate. I printed it, placed it in the folder at the back of my bottom drawer, and wrote 4 words in my calendar for the following morning. After the dinner call, Marin. Then I straightened my tie, put on my coat, and went to pick up Corinne. 15 years is long enough to know when a room is going to be difficult before you walk into it. The annual leadership dinner at Langston Freight Systems was always that kind of room, all polished surfaces and careful laughter. Everyone performing a version of themselves they'd rehearsed on the drive over. Corinne had been attending these dinners for 11 years. This was the first year she'd been seated at the head table, and she had been quietly excited about it for weeks. I was glad for her. Whatever else had changed between us over the years, I never stopped being glad when she reached something she'd worked hard to reach. I was seated next to her, which meant I was seated next to Gavin Rourke. Gavin was the kind of man who had learned early in life that confidence was a costume, and he'd been wearing it so long he'd forgotten there was nothing underneath. He managed a regional accounts division, drove a car that was slightly too expensive for his salary, and had a habit of asking people questions he already believed he knew the answers to. Every time we'd crossed paths at one of these events, he'd found a way to ask me what I did for a living, always with that same smile, the one that said he was enjoying the answer before I'd finished giving it. I'd always told him the same thing: independent consulting. It was true enough. It just wasn't complete. 15 years ago, Langston Freight Systems was 3 months away from folding. I was 28, running a small transportation consulting firm, and had more capital than anyone my age had a reasonable right to. The details of what happened next aren't the kind of thing I ever talked about at dinner parties. My attorney, Marin Ellison, structured a family trust. The trust acquired 90% of Langston's shares through a quiet merger that saved the company, kept the payroll running, and allowed Everett Langston to remain CEO in every way that mattered publicly. My name appeared nowhere on any document that the average person would think to look at. I didn't do it for anonymity. I did it because I was 28, and I had just started dating a woman named Corinne, and I didn't want the first thing she learned about me to be a number. I wanted her to know me before she knew what I was worth. That decision made sense when I made it. What I didn't account for was that silence, the kind you choose on purpose for good reasons, has a way of filling itself in. When you don't explain yourself, other people do it for you. And the version they write is rarely generous. The dinner started at 7. By 8:30, Gavin was on his 3rd glass of wine and in the mood to perform. I noticed it before he said anything, the way he kept glancing in my direction, testing whether the moment was right. Everett Langston was seated at the far end of the table, talking to one of the board members about a logistics contract. Corinne was in a conversation with the woman to her left, smiling the way she did when she was genuinely engaged. The room had the comfortable warmth of people who felt safe, which is usually when someone decides to remind everyone of the pecking order. Gavin stood up, glass in hand, and said he wanted to make a small toast. He looked directly at me when he said it. He asked me in front of the entire table what it felt like to be the man going home with the real talent in the room. He said it like he was being playful. A few people laughed, the uncertain laugh of people who weren't sure yet if they were supposed to. Then Gavin kept going, said, "Corinne was out there closing contracts worth millions of dollars, and here I was probably keeping busy at home. Maybe watching television. Maybe sorting the mail. The laughter got louder. Everett Langston said something from the end of the table. I couldn't hear exactly what it was, but I could tell by the way he said it that he wasn't actually asking Gavin to stop. He was just creating the appearance of having said something so that later he could tell himself he had. That was Everett's particular skill, the gesture that looked like action and required none. I looked at Corinne. I had been carrying a quiet unease about our marriage for longer than I wanted to admit, the sense that something between us had been shifting slowly the way foundations shift before anyone notices the cracks. 3 years ago, she had seen a bank statement on my desk. The balance was the kind of number that shouldn't have belonged to a man with no visible career. She had looked at it for several seconds, then walked out of the room without a word, and had never asked me about it. At the time, I told myself she trusted me. Later, I started to wonder if she'd simply decided not to believe what she'd seen. When Gavin finished his little speech, I heard Corinne laugh. Not the reluctant, "what do I do" laugh. Not the laugh of someone buying time. She laughed the way you laugh when someone says something you've been thinking yourself, and finally someone else has said it out loud. Her shoulder moved against mine. It was a small thing. It was the thing that undid 15 years in about 4 seconds. Gavin leaned back in his chair, comfortable the way people are when they believe they've just won something, and said the whole room felt sorry for me. He said it the way you say something that's finished the conversation. I sat with it for a moment. Not because I didn't know what to do, but because I wanted to be sure. I thought about the email that morning. I thought about the folder in my desk drawer and the 5 emails that had come before it. I thought about Marin's voice on the phone, her particular kind of calm, the kind that only comes from knowing exactly what the paperwork says. I thought about Everett at the end of the table, already looking away. I set my fork down. I stood up slowly, the way I do everything slowly when something matters. I fastened the middle button of my jacket. Then I looked at Everett Langston, not at Gavin, not at the table at Everett, and told him he had approximately 48 hours left in his position. I told him the man the room had been laughing at was the man who would be signing the decision to remove him. The room didn't go quiet gradually. It went quiet all at once, the way a fire goes out when the oxygen is suddenly gone. Someone's glass clinked against the table. Corinne's hand pulled away from my arm. I didn't look at her when it happened. I could feel the exact moment she realized she was sitting next to someone she had never actually known. I walked out of the dining room, through the lobby, and into the cold Chicago air. I took out my phone and dialed before I reached the car. I had written after the dinner call Marin that morning. It was still the dinner. Close enough. Marin picked up on the second ring. I told her I needed a full audit on Langston's procurement contracts for the last 3 years, everything that had passed through Gavin Rourke's division. She didn't ask why that night. She just said she'd have a team in place by morning. I stood on the sidewalk outside the hotel, watching taxis move through the wet Chicago street, and felt the cold work its way through my jacket. Corinne found me before I reached the car. She came through the lobby doors, still holding her small evening bag. Her face caught somewhere between anger and embarrassment. She asked me what I had just done in there. I told her I had said what was true. She said that wasn't an answer, and I said it was the only one I had for her right now. We drove home without speaking, and the silence between us had a different quality than the silences we'd grown used to over the years. Those silences had been comfortable, or at least familiar. This one had weight. When we got to the house, I went to my office. There's a shelf of books along the back wall that I've had since before we were married. Behind the second shelf from the bottom, there's a panel that doesn't look like anything. I pressed it, and it released a narrow drawer I'd built into the wall when we first moved in. Inside was a flat steel box. I carried it to the dining room table and set it down in front of Corinne without saying anything. Inside the box was the merger agreement from 15 years ago. The trust documents Marin had drafted, years of tax filings. The shareholder records, everything that proved in dry legal language that the man she'd been embarrassed to introduce at company parties was the reason those parties had anything to celebrate. I watched her read. She was a fast reader normally, but she moved slowly through these pages, going back to reread things, which told me she understood what she was looking at. When she finally set the last page down, she asked me why I had never told her. I said I had wanted her to love me before she knew what I owned. She said that wasn't fair, that she'd had a right to know who she was married to. She was right. I didn't argue with her. I reached over, opened my laptop, and played her an audio file I had carried on my hard drive for 11 years. The recording was from a dinner party she'd been to without me. I'd been traveling that week. Someone had been recording background audio on their phone, and the file had ended up forwarded around in a group chat I'd been accidentally included in. Corinne's voice came through clearly, laughing with a friend in the kitchen, describing her husband. She said I didn't really do anything. She said there was always money, always more than enough, and she didn't understand where it came from, but honestly, she'd stopped thinking about it because Desmond just kind of existed in their life. The friend had laughed. Corinne had laughed too. I had listened to that file once when I found it, then saved it and never played it again. We had lived for 11 years with that conversation sitting between us without either of us acknowledging it. She stared at the laptop speaker after it ended, as if she could not fully connect the voice she was hearing to herself. Then she said she had been embarrassed that every woman in that friend group was married to a doctor or a lawyer or someone with a title they could name at a dinner table, and I had given her nothing she could point to. She said she hadn't meant it as cruelly as it sounded. I believed her. That was the part that made it harder, not easier. We slept in separate rooms that night. 40 hours later, the report landed in my inbox. What Gavin had done was not especially complicated. These things rarely are. Over several years, he had quietly redirected a series of freight contracts to a logistics company owned by a cousin of his, marking them up at each step and pocketing the spread. The individual transactions were small enough to slip past routine review. In total, the company had lost over $600,000. What I hadn't expected was the email thread the auditors pulled from the internal server. In those messages, Gavin had referred to me regularly, always in the same terms: a burden, a man without ambition, someone Corinne was quietly carrying, though she was too gracious to say so herself. He had been running this commentary for years, seeding it into the conversations Corinne was part of, making sure she absorbed it slowly enough that it felt like her own conclusion. I had Gavin's access credentials revoked by 7 in the morning. Security met him at the lobby when he arrived and walked him out with his personal items in a box. Exactly 48 hours after I had left that dining room, I walked into Langston Freight Systems' boardroom. I had been in this building hundreds of times over 15 years, always as a quiet presence no one could quite place. This was the first time I walked in as what I actually was. Marin was already seated when I arrived, the trust documents organized in the order she knew they'd be needed. Everett was at the head of the table. When he saw me come in with Marin, something moved across his face that he quickly rearranged into something more composed. He suggested we handle this privately. I told him there was nothing I had to say to him that required privacy. I told him he had approved contracts he hadn't read, signed off on vendor relationships he hadn't examined, and allowed a culture of favoritism to run through his leadership team for years, not because he hadn't noticed, but because noticing would have required him to act. Marin laid the trust documents on the table in front of him. His tenure as CEO ended in that moment, even if the paperwork took another few minutes to confirm it. Then I introduced Tessa Rowland. Tessa came in from the hallway wearing her work clothes, the kind you wear when you've come directly from a distribution center. She had been with the company for 9 years, had redesigned the entire warehouse routing system in her 3rd year, and had saved the company close to $200,000 annually in the process. 4 times she had been considered for promotion. 4 times the position had gone to someone else. I knew her work in detail, and I knew her work because she was the one who had sent me 6 anonymous emails over 5 years, each one more precise than the last, flagging exactly the kind of misconduct the audit had now confirmed. When she saw me, she asked directly if I had read her emails. I told her I had read all of them, starting with the first. She asked why I had waited so long to act. I told her it was the right question, and I didn't have a satisfying answer for it. I'd believed I was being careful collecting evidence until the case was airtight. What I hadn't fully accounted for was the cost of that patience to the people who were still inside the building while I waited. A board member named Gordon Pierce raised his objection almost immediately. Something about protocol, about what it would signal to bring an operations employee directly into the top role. I asked Gordon how many times Tessa's name had come up for advancement in the last 4 years, and how many times the position had gone to someone he'd had lunch with instead. Gordon didn't answer. Marin presented the full audit findings to the room. After that, there were no more objections. Tessa Rowland was appointed CEO of Langston Freight Systems before noon. I should have felt something cleaner after that. But when I walked out of that boardroom, what settled over me wasn't satisfaction. It was something closer to tiredness, the kind that comes not from what you've done, but from what you've been carrying and can't quite put down. Corinne was waiting in the hallway. She pulled me into an empty conference room and closed the door. She told me that 6 months ago she had printed divorce papers. She said she had sat in her car outside a lawyer's office for nearly an hour with the folder on the passenger seat, and then she had driven home and put the papers in her desk and hadn't touched them since. She said Gavin had been talking to her for years in hallways after meetings over drinks with colleagues, always in that careful, reasonable tone, always circling back to the same point that I was going nowhere, that she was covering for me without realizing it, that a woman like her deserved someone who matched her. She had listened. Not all at once, but slowly, the way you absorb something that's repeated often enough that it starts to sound like your own thought. Then she told me something that landed differently. She said that a few years ago, Gavin had shown her a document, a merger agreement with my name on it, and a company valuation large enough that her first reaction had been that it couldn't be real. She had held it in her hands and decided it was a forgery, some kind of manipulation she didn't understand. She had put it down and never asked me about it. I looked at her for a long moment. I told her it wasn't the not knowing that had worn me down over the years. It was the choosing not to find out. That every time there had been a question she could have asked me, she had found a way around it. She had trusted Gavin's version of me more than she had ever trusted me to tell her my own. I left her in that room and went to get my car. The conversation at home that evening was the hardest one we'd had in 15 years. Corinne asked me how I could hold this secret for so long and still expect her to feel close to me. I told her about the job offer I'd received 11 years ago, a position in New York more than double what I was making, a title that would have satisfied everyone's expectations. I had spent a week turning it over before I declined. She had been 2 years away from a promotion she'd been building toward for 6 years, one tied entirely to her staying in Chicago. If I had taken that offer, she would have had to choose. I had made the choice for her without telling her, and then a few months later, I had heard her tell a friend that her husband had no ambition. She sat down on the kitchen floor when I told her that. After a while, she told me she had opened a separate bank account 8 months ago. She had been transferring small amounts each month, quietly building toward something over $11,000 a door she was keeping open just in case. I thought about the system I had set up 8 months ago for almost exactly the same reason. We had been preparing for the same ending from opposite sides of the same marriage, and neither of us had said a word about it to the other. Her mother called while we were still sitting in that silence. Rosalie spoke quickly the way she did when she was trying to get something out before she lost her nerve. She said she had found out something that afternoon and she needed to say it directly. For years she had encouraged Corinne to reconsider the marriage, had never trusted me, had never thought I was the right kind of man for her daughter. But she had just learned that the medical bills from her heart procedures, multiple surgeries, and years of follow-up care had been paid in full quietly by me. She said she had suspected it 2 years ago, when she noticed the balance on her account never seemed to grow the way it should have, but she hadn't asked because asking would have required her to be wrong about me, and she hadn't been ready for that. She apologized. She said she had spent 15 years measuring me by what she could see and ignoring everything she couldn't. I told her I appreciated her saying it. I meant it. After the call ended, I went upstairs. I told Corinne there was one more thing, and that I would tell her about it in the morning. Then I closed the bedroom door and sat in the dark for a long time, thinking about a system I had built 8 months ago and the night I had nearly let it run. The next morning, I told Corinne about the backup system. I told her I had built it 8 months ago, the same month she had opened her private account, though I hadn't known that until last night. I'd asked Marin to help me set it up an encrypted archive containing the trust documents, the audit evidence I'd been accumulating on Gavin, the records of Everett's approvals, and the audio file I had carried on my hard drive for 11 years. The system was designed to send automatically to the board to 3 investigative journalists Marin had identified to the relevant regulatory contacts on a fixed schedule. Every 3 months, I had to log in and manually renew the hold. If I didn't, everything went out. What I hadn't told her yet was what had happened the night of the dinner itself. After I walked out of the hotel and called Marin, I had stood on that sidewalk for a long time before I reached the car. I opened the management application on my phone. The renewal window was closing in 6 hours. All I had to do was nothing, just put the phone in my pocket, drive home, and let the clock run out. Every document would have been delivered before sunrise. Gavin's career would have ended before he woke up. Everett's tenure would have been finished in a way he couldn't manage quietly. And the audio file of Corinne's voice laughing about her husband who didn't really do anything would have been part of the package. I had stood there holding the phone and understood something about myself that I didn't particularly like. In that moment, I wasn't thinking about justice. I was thinking about the look on the faces of everyone who had laughed. I was thinking about Corinne's shoulder moving against mine. I was in that moment closer to becoming the kind of man I'd spent my life trying not to be than I had ever been before. I renewed the hold. Not because I had forgiven anyone, because I still loved my wife more than I wanted to watch the world confirm my anger was justified. I put the phone in my pocket and got in the car. When I finished telling her all of this, she didn't say anything for a long time. She sat at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold. Then she asked if the system was still running. I told her it was. I had set it up 8 months before that night, which meant I had already renewed it once before the dinner and then renewed it again afterward, which meant I had now made the same choice twice to hold, not to release. She asked why I kept it running if I wasn't going to use it. I told her the honest answer: I didn't know how to stop needing it. That some part of me still required the knowledge that I had a door I could open because every other door in my life had been one that other people could close without telling me. She nodded slowly and said she understood that feeling better than I probably expected her to. 3 months passed. Langston Freight Systems held its annual recognition ceremony at the same hotel where the dinner had taken place. Tessa had pushed to change the venue, but I told her to keep it. Some things are worth returning to. In the 3 months since her appointment, Tessa had moved quickly and precisely the way people do when they've been waiting years to do the work they were always capable of. She terminated every contract that traced back to Gavin's network, brought in an independent auditing firm on a permanent retainer, and promoted 6 people who had been overlooked for years, not as a gesture but because she had reviewed their records herself, and the case for each of them was straightforward. People who had worked there for a decade told me the hallways felt lighter, which sounds like something you'd dismiss as sentiment until you've spent enough time in organizations where the hallways feel heavy. At the ceremony, Tessa called me to the stage. She didn't use flowery language. She said that the company had been protected for 15 years by someone most of them had never known, and that it was past time they knew his name. I walked up in the same dark suit I had worn to the dinner 3 months ago. That was intentional. I wanted to be recognizable as the same man who had sat at that table and said nothing while the room laughed, because I was the same man, and the difference between that night and this one wasn't that I had changed. It was that the room finally had the information it needed to see clearly. I looked out at the audience and found Corinne in the 3rd row. She wasn't wearing the expression I'd seen at these events for years, that careful, composed look of someone managing how they appear. She was just watching me. There was something in her face that I recognized as real respect, the kind that doesn't perform itself, and underneath it, something that looked like grief, the particular grief of someone who understands what they almost threw away. I said that the most satisfying form of justice isn't the kind that tears something down. It's the kind that builds something better in its place and makes sure the people who deserved recognition all along are finally standing in the right rooms. I looked at Tessa when I said it. She gave me a small nod, the kind that means more than applause. After the ceremony, Corinne and I walked to the car together. The drive home was quiet, but the silence was different from every silence that had come before it. It felt more like two people who had been running for a long time and had finally found a place to sit down. We ended up on the front steps of the house. The Chicago evening was cool and clear, the city's lights spread out in every direction. Corinne sat beside me, and she apologized, not the kind of apology that asks for something in return, but the kind that simply names what happened. She said she had not defended me when she should have not once across 15 years of small moments and one very large one. She said she had let other people fill in the story of who I was because doing the work of knowing me herself was harder, and she had chosen the easier version. She said she didn't know how to fix that, but she wanted to try. I took her hand. I told her we could start over, but only if the truth lived between us this time instead of being buried on either side of us. She said yes. It was a quiet yes, but she meant it. A few days later, Rosalie came to the house. She brought a cake she had baked herself lemon because she remembered it was something I had mentioned liking once years ago in a passing comment I had long forgotten. She stood at the door holding it with both hands and called me her son. It was the first time in 15 years she had called me anything other than my first name, and she said it simply without making a production of it, which was the only way it could have landed as genuinely as it did. She told Corinne that the fear she had carried about her daughter's future had made her careless with the truth that she had planted doubts she had no right to plant. She looked at me directly and said she had spent 15 years measuring me by standards she now understood had been the wrong ones entirely, and she was sorry. I told her I appreciated it. I meant that too. That evening after Rosalie had gone home, I brought my laptop out to the porch where Corinne was sitting. I opened the backup system and turned the screen toward her. I walked her through every component of it, the file structure, the distribution list, the renewal schedule, the exact contents of what would have gone out if I had ever let the clock run down. She read through it carefully and didn't rush. When she was done, she looked at me and asked what had made me renew it each time instead of simply deleting it. I told her the same thing I had said the morning after the dinner, that I hadn't known how to let go of the door. That holding on to it had felt like the only form of protection I still had that was entirely mine. She didn't argue with that. She just asked if I was ready to let go of it now. I turned the screen back toward me. I selected the archive, opened the deletion prompt, and confirmed it. The system asked me to confirm a second time, which Marin had built in deliberately because she knew me well enough to know I didn't make choices like this casually. I confirmed it again. The files cleared. The scheduled sends disappeared from the queue. The application closed and there was nothing left in it. I set the laptop on the table beside me and didn't reach for it again. What I told Corinne then was something I had been working out in my head for 3 months. Deleting those files didn't mean I had forgotten what happened. It meant I was no longer willing to let what had hurt me dictate the shape of what came next. I told her I needed one thing from both of us going forward, that when something was true and important, we said it out loud to each other regardless of how difficult it was to say. That we stop building private architectures of protection and start building something we could both actually live inside. She said she could do that. I believed her, not completely, not yet, because trust doesn't come back all at once. But I believed she meant it in that moment, and that was enough to begin. The weeks that followed were ordinary in the way that things are ordinary when the crisis has passed, and what remains is the actual work. Corinne started asking me questions she had never asked before. Not grand questions, but real ones. What a particular negotiation had felt like. Whether I was confident about a decision I'd made. What I was worried about. I started answering in the same register, which was harder than it sounds after 15 years of keeping my own counsel. I had to relearn that sharing a weight doesn't always mean losing your footing under it. Sometimes it just means the weight becomes something two people carry instead of one. Sunday dinners with Rosalie came back slowly. She asked me about my work genuinely, specifically the way you ask someone about something when you're actually curious about the answer. We didn't become a different family overnight, but we became a more honest one, and that turned out to matter more than I had expected. There is a particular kind of evening in Chicago in early autumn when the air hasn't decided yet whether it belongs to summer or winter, and the light sits low over the rooftops and turns everything a color that doesn't have a name. Corinne and I were on the front steps the first time I noticed that the silence between us had changed for good. There were no more files in a steel box behind a false panel, no backup systems on a private server, no folder in a bottom drawer, no account held in reserve against the possibility of departure. What was between us now was just the truth of 15 years, the good parts and the painful parts, the silences that had cost us and the words we were finally learning to say, and the choice made plainly without drama to stay. I have always believed that the value of a person is not in what they announce. It's in what they carry without being asked, and what they choose to set down when carrying it no longer serves anyone. I had carried a great deal for a long time. Some of it was worth carrying. Some of it I should have put down years earlier, and the cost of that delay was real. But here is what I know now: the people who love us cannot protect what they cannot see. And a relationship only starts to heal when both people stop using silence as armor and start choosing honesty instead, not because it's easy, but because it's the only thing that actually holds. If any part of this story stayed with you, if you've ever felt unseen or realized too late that you'd been looking at someone through someone else's eyes, I think you'd find more stories like this one worth your time. There's a subscribe button right below this video. It's a small thing, but it means these stories find their way to more people who might need them. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next one.